Jack, you're on the line. How are you doing?
Good. In regards to like dismissal of supernatural claims, and I don't want to pigeonhole either of you if these, aren't your positions. It just seems to be a common refrain. So if at the end of this you say, hey, that's, that has nothing to do with my own basis in skepticism or atheism, feel free to stop me. But
Sure.
I just wanted to start off with basically the idea that in order for any claim to be dismissed, there has to be an implicit framework for that claim to be verified or dismissed. Like as an example, if there was, say, a piece of chicken in front of three guys and they were all they were trying to figure out if it was cooked or not. And the one guy said he wanted to put his hand on the chicken to see if it was warm to indicate if it had been heated. Another guy said, I want to cut into it, see if it was pink on the inside. A third guy said, I wanted to use a meat thermometer to see if it was hot all the way to the core. There would be an implicit, need to make a argument for why each of these things can be used to verify if the chicken is cooked or not. And so what I meant by my first point is that, when we talk about, dismissal of supernatural claims, there needs to be an argument for why the axis along which we dismiss them is legitimate. And that's what I meant by the burden of proof is not only on theists. Does that make sense at all, or
Not
Can you tell us at all
really.
what you mean by dismiss? So do you acknowledge that there's a difference between unproven and dismissed?
Yeah, if I need to be more specific, I'm happy to be. Like as an example, like if someone were to say like, X happened, I saw an elephant, the framework by which you either believe them or do not believe them. So yeah, if fail to believe is a better example or a better kind of phrase, I'm happy to use that.
Okay. So I'm unclear what you're trying to say.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that, in order to believe or fail to believe something, there's generally there has to be a case to be made on why we ought believe this claim or why we ought not believe this claim. And that general axis needs to be demonstrated that it's viable and sound, basically. Does this make sense? I hope I'm not being too good.
I don't understand the relation. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I just did. Like you started out with a thing about chicken and you gave 3 examples of how you could probably demonstrate that the chicken was cooked. Those are 3 different ways to prove a thing. You ought to believe it if you can prove it true. What are you getting at here with like dismissing the claim and or not believing it, even though you have a reason to believe it?
Well, the example I gave with the chicken was somewhat specific because, like in the example of the chicken, there's varying levels of viability to each of these tests, right? Like a chicken could be warm on the outside and not be cooked all the way.
Right. That's why we talk about accuracy and precision when we talk about scientific experimentation. Something needs to be accurate and precise because those are different measures, different metrics. Right. I get that.
Sure. And
so you would want to use the meat thermometer test because it's the most accurate and most precise test, right? So touching the chicken would be a bad test, but it's better test than no test. That's why we say every scientific model is wrong, but some of them are useful. So yeah, I get that. Where are you going with it to say that reliance on scientific evidence is not viable and the burden of proof is not only on you? Where does this relate to what you called into?
Yeah. So the way this relates is that in regards to these various tests, there are times and examples where we can't always use scientific evidence, not because there's no theoretical scientific evidence, just because none exist at the moment or can be produced at the moment. The big example that I came away thinking about over the last couple of weeks is novel experiences. You know what I mean? Say if a person, from Europe in the Middle Ages was to see a Nile crocodile for the first time or an elephant or something. Assuming there was some level of science, and science was limited at the time, obviously, but say they were from Western Europe, some more developed part of Italy, what have you, and they had some base scientific evidence, they still could be in contact with a novel experience and not have scientific evidence to verify, its validity. And so my general point that I'm trying to get at and how to relate this to theism is that the failing of relying on scientific evidence seems to me that it doesn't really have a model for novel experiences that just haven't been measured heretofore. Does that make sense?
No. it doesn't.
Oh.
So here's the thing.
Okay, well.
So let's say someone said you're trying. I think you're trying to describe a situation where someone sees a crocodile and they've never seen one before, right? Is that what you're basically trying to say?
Well,
Is your example?
Well, and
it's
critically, there's been no record of a crocodile that's reached
Sure.
them before.
Okay,
no
awesome.
metric or
Cool.
measure.
A new thing
All right.
happens. Yeah.
So a new thing happened. So he runs back to the village and he tells his buddy, I saw this creature that I'm describing it to you, and it's a log with teeth, and you don't get it. Oh, that's amazing. Whatever. They could all walk back to the village. They could all walk back there, and they could see footprints theoretically, or maybe the creature's still there, or maybe there is something that has been eaten in a unique way that is unique to, like, there's lots of hypothetical things that could corroborate
Like
the story.
Absolutely.
What's getting me the most is, like, you're saying, well, we don't have a scientific way of handling a unique situation. How do you think we've learned anything about anything? Everything was a new, unique discovery at one point or another. There was a time, indeed, when somebody saw a crocodile for the first time with no prior understanding of what that was. And you know what we did? We did the shit that Paul recommended. We all went and saw it. We wrote down notes about it. We cut one open. We found more things like it. We put them together on a tree. Like, we learned what the thing was because we saw the thing. The first step of the scientific the scientific method is observation. You see something novel, you make an observation, and I wonder what that's all about. And then you figure it out from there. Of course, there's a method for figuring out novel experiences. What are you talking about?
Well, I can be more specific if you like. I promise you, it's not something I haven't thought about. I'd love it
if you would be as specific as possible, because this is like the third time now we've just said nothing.
Okay, I apologize. Take in the example of the crocodile, like you were saying. Yes, it's true. People could go back and view the crocodile and possibly find it. But if the crocodile was gone, they wouldn't be able to find it. And most critically, what I'm trying to get at is, for the individual guy who first sees the crocodile, he does not have anything but his own observations. Observation is part of the scientific method, but it's not conclusionary. If that was the case, then anyone who observed anything supernatural would have scientific evidence of it. Observation is not enough.
Okay.
As, I've heard on the show.
So you are talking about Humean, whether testimony ever can be valid evidence for a unique experience. You're talking about testimony now, right? Okay, cool. You could have opened with, is testimony is a valid is so here's the thing about testimony. Testimony is always potentially mistaken, potentially correct, potentially a lie. Right? Always. All testimony.
It's the worst kind of evidence.
So the trouble is if someone is giving testimony of something outside of our normal experience, you need to then the weight of that testimony needs to overcome the possibility that it is either a lie or mistaken. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So when you come to someone like myself and Forrest, and if you're not also a methodological naturalist, you can let me know. But I'm thinking we're both methodological naturalists as opposed to philosophical naturalists. We're not saying supernatural things could never happen, but so far we haven't seen any. So we are operating in the realm of that's our worldview. So when you want someone to testify, I am super familiar with people who have lied, and I'm super familiar with people who are mistaken, including myself. I have told people stories and found out later that I was wrong. So when it comes to testimony about something supernatural, for someone like me, it's going to seem more reasonable that they're lying or mistaken, right?
Yeah. Yes, I somewhat track with that. I mean, I would push back a little bit on the sense of like trust. If you could find someone who you trusted to a greater degree, you might have more reason to believe a more fantastical claim than another person.
So no, like it's anyway. But what I wanted to get to was you're not wrong in that person who saw the crocodile has some justification for thinking that a crocodile is an animal. Or if you see a miracle, you have some justification for thinking that maybe miracles are possible. But that doesn't, unfortunately, translate to other people. That is not a good reason for someone else to think that there's a new animal that we've never seen, or that for someone else to think that there's a miracle. That is a problem with testimony. It's not testimony's fault, but it's just the reality of things. Like, so if the Holy Spirit is probably the best way I'm going to become a Christian again, right? Some experience that I'm convinced is from heaven, but that will never be evidence for Forrest. I could describe it all day long, and that would just suck, though. Like, God would have communicated with me, but it's just not transferable. And so I think you've called in to say, hey, we should just accept this thing that is not transferable as good. And it's like, well, it is good for an individual, maybe, but it doesn't work in a group. And I'm sorry, Forrest, I totally jumped over that one.
No, I appreciate you doing so, because like you go ahead and answer, Jack, and then I'll have a different question.
Okay. Yeah. So I kind of came in with trying to get towards two conclusions, which is one, that personal observations due to the fact of novel phenomenon have to be, to some extent, at least more accepted than it seems like it's given credence often, specifically with talk about, hallucinations and that sort of stuff. And secondly, I mean, this is perhaps something we disagree on fundamentally, but I do think that there is levels of fantastical belief relative to the amount of trust you have in a person speaks to that. That doesn't mean that if you don't trust a person and you hear them say, hey, I saw, aliens, or I saw, someone rise from the dead, that you believe them. It just means that there's different levels to which, you assign credibility to a story, regardless of the fact, or, well, in relation to the facts, rather, based off how trustworthy they seem to be. Does that make sense, at least in theory, on both those points?
Well, I mean, everyone can have their own epistemology, and if that's what you're choosing, I mean, we don't even choose what convinces us. So if that's something that's built into your epistemology to convince you, I can't say that that's wrong. That is something that convinces you.
I think
I would just argue now that, go ahead.
No. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize.
I've now lost track, so go for it.
Oh, fuck. I'm an asshole. I was going to say, I was just going to build off of what you were saying and say, I think it also has to do with the size of the claim. Like there's a lot of people, I teach science on my channel. There's a lot of people who would trust what I said about it if they're not familiar with the topic and I'm explaining it the best I can. They might take that as something. But if I'm explaining like population genetics and like how we can track evolutionary change, like in my Light of Evolution series, which you should totally go watch. Like if I'm talking about that, that's one thing. And people can take that at face value because that's something that I've studied and I'm now passing on what I know about it. It would be like if I called my friend and said, hey, I ordered a pizza last night. They'd be like, why the fuck are you telling me? Okay, cool. That's a claim. They don't need evidence for it besides me telling them. If they really want to know, they might go crack open a biology book and fact check what I'm saying. They might look for the receipt of the pizza that I bought, whatever. It's a very different thing if I call up somebody or if I stand here on this show and say, hey, did you know that the moon is hollow and it's actually run by gophers? There's a whole colony of gophers in there, the whole society living in the moon, and it's a spaceship. The moon's a spaceship run by gophers. Now, all of a sudden, you're not going to be like, well, I trust Forrest. I mean, like, Forrest knows this stuff. Sure. He's a good guy. He wouldn't lie to me about this. If you think that, you're stupid. You should be asking for more evidence of that, no matter who's telling you that, right? So when you're telling me like, well, there's some things you don't really need proof for, and testimony kind of works sometimes, right? As Paul was saying, what I wanted to build off of that is just like, there's different levels of that. It's not just a blanket, I can trust some things sometimes. Like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you're going to call up in the show and say that you prefer sushi over, barbecue, cool. I don't give half a fuck. I'll take your word for it. But if you're going to call on the show and say there's a reason to believe in a God, I need a lot more than your personal testimony. And I do need scientific evidence for that. Like that's not just something to just believe. That's a very big, expensive claim. Do you hear where we're coming from?
I do understand where you're coming from. The one thing I have and this, to be clear, is not like, to be clear, I do think some level of skepticism is absolutely appropriate for supernatural claims. I do not believe every supernatural claim that was ever made. That's not what I'm advocating. The problem seems to me to be that it seems as though oftentimes the likelihood of a supernatural event is de facto defined as zero. This is why I hear some atheists say, I don't know if it's either you, that they're not sure what would convince them if a God existed. And
right.
If you're not sure what would exist to you, that how could you define obviously anything you see could be a hallucination. It could be some But like at some point, it seems to almost slip into the realm of solipsism. If like you see someone rise from the dead, say they're Jesus Christ, do something material, and like leave, and then you're like, well, I could have just had a hallucination, especially if like several people see it with you or something like that. Do you at least follow that?
So a few responses. So if you skip that, I'm going to ignore that a few people saw it with you, because now you're changing the variables. So we're talking about whether testimony alone. Something can convince me, because that's external corroboration, right? So now we're talking about whether just you want to say, well, skeptics are over skeptical about this person. Because if you have a personal experience like that and you don't at least consider that it might have been a hallucination, then you are too credulous, right? Like I have people throw that in my face all the time. You would go you'd go get your brain checked out, or you'd go do something. I'm like, why would you not? Also, if you saw something like that, you need to be at least somewhat credulous. But I hope what you got built into what I said initially was there's three possibilities. Someone's accurately telling you what happened. Someone's inaccurately telling you what happened, and they're mistaken. Like it's true, they're lying, or they're mistaken. You're just, all you're trying to do is slide the levers on those three things. And what we're saying is, yeah, of course you slide the levers on those things. And Forrest is saying the same thing. What I'm saying, the claim has to overcome the likelihood that someone is lying or mistaken. And of course, knowing something about the person, if they're a habitual liar, well, all of a sudden, almost any claim, makes them think that they're lying. So of course you build some of those other things in. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, if a claim still seems less likely than the person who's always telling the truth, or is so prescient and aware of their situation that they never mistake one thing for another, right? Like you have to.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that those are the levers that we have when it comes to testimony. And when you bring in other things that might corroborate, then you're not talking about testimony anymore. So
yeah, I get that, and I don't want to. Oh, you go ahead. Sorry.
I just think, and you seem to be telling us that we need to be more credulous. And
that's kind of why I think that's.
And I guess you are. You're basically saying, well, people might be telling the truth, and they might be, but that's why I'm like, well, I like corroboration. So testimony alone for me is never gonna. So my worldview is such that I have never experienced anything supernatural. I've never experienced anything that I believe was supernatural, even though at the time sometimes I did, and that I don't have sufficient evidence outside of myself to think that supernatural things exist. So when I'm presented with a supernatural claim, for me, lying or mistaken are gonna seem more probable without corroboration. That's just I'm stuck there. I have to live there. If God is real, that my standards were too high. We don't choose what convinces us, so I'm just stuck there.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I came on the show not really knowing you guys' personal experience with this. My specific argument here is more for people who either have personal experience that they think can reasonably be attributed to supernatural, or two, have people who they seriously trust who claim to have, experience with the supernatural. If neither of those things apply to you guys, it's not an argument for you. It's just common that I've heard from many atheists to say, I had this experience, but I'm not sure if it was a hallucination, or someone say like I have many family members who claim to have had this experience who I trust, who, never seem to lie to me. Again, I'm not trying to say like you should never consider hallucinations. You should never consider that. It just seems like the tautology of saying that, they're like the supernatural is supremely unlikely. I mean, I guess in that sense, I am asking you to be slightly more credulous, but I'm not saying if you haven't had experience or you don't have anyone you trust the testimony of who's had experience that you should believe. I'm basing mine purely on that hill, if that makes sense.
Let me try a different angle just for a second, because in the call screen here, you wrote that pure reliance on scientific evidence is not viable, and the burden of proof is not only on theists. That's what you put in there. So we've been talking a lot about like who you should believe and why and when and all these things, but just taking what you put in there and kind of running with it for a second. What's the alternative to scientific evidence that would make you believe a thing? It sounds like you're just saying you might just want to, or somebody you trust. And why do you think we have a burden of proof as atheists? Because it sounds like those two are kind of related, and it sounds like we've skipped over it. And we have I'll give it a couple more minutes before the end of the call.
Okay, I'm not trying to waste anyone's time.
No, of course not.
but,
I'm just telling you where the line is because I'm not trying to tell you to hurry up.
I'm enjoying the conversation. Very good, Jack. You're doing a great
have
job.
two other people that I want to get to, and we only have about an hour left, is all.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so first off, in relation to the scientific method, the time when I would not believe the scientific method was, and that's why I gave the specific example of a crocodile for a medieval European. If I was in the woods, or excuse me, the swamps of Portugal, shall we say, and I saw a Nile crocodile for the first time, I would not wait for scientific evidence that thing that I'd never seen any quantifiable basis for existed. I would
you
just run
seeing
the
the thing is one thing. What I'm saying is, if I tell you right now that
Sure.
I have a pet elephant in my backyard, you can say, I do believe you, that is true, or I don't believe you, that isn't true, or just I don't believe you. Yes, it's true. No, it's not true, or I don't believe you. Those are three different claims. So if I go in my backyard and see an elephant, I have firsthand account of that happening. I have a reason to believe it. If I tell you, you can say, yes, I believe you. That requires evidence to do, or trust, I suppose. But it would be kind of a big claim for you to be trusting on. You can say, no, that's not true, which also requires evidence. You need to be able to prove that it's not true to say it isn't. Or you can just say, I don't believe you. Until you give me a reason to believe, I'm not going to accept it, which is what we're doing as atheists. You're saying there's a God. I'm not saying sure there isn't, because I've never proven that there isn't, which doesn't make any sense to do. I'm saying I don't believe you. Give me a reason to believe it. And you're saying, well, I have eyewitness. I saw it. And I'm saying, cool, that changes jack shit for me. So here we are again, like what you're saying, we can't rely on scientific evidence. What's the alternative? It seems like what you're giving us is just trust me. It's trust me, bro, I saw it. And that's not good enough for us, nor should it be good enough for you, especially for something as big as a God claim. It's not like the pizza example that I talked about. It's the big God claim. And then you're saying the burden of proof doesn't lie on it. How could I prove to you that I don't believe you? Where's the burden of proof for me when I say I don't have a reason to accept what you're saying right now? How on earth could you justify saying that I need to prove my disbelief of a thing? It sounds like you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what atheism is, or what like we're supposed to do to believe in something. And as Paul eloquently put a minute ago, it sounds like you're just asking us to be more gullible. And I don't understand how that's your position. And you've clarified it several times, and we've gotten nowhere. So just can you please explain to me, like, how that makes sense? How are you squaring that circle in your head?
Okay, so to be clear, when I in the example I was talking about, there's two separate things I'm trying to talk about. Number one is obviously to trust your own eyes, to trust your own senses in the experience of a novel phenomena.
Sure.
The secondary thing is trusting people you have reason to trust reporting a novel phenomena.
On some things, on small things, you trust somebody, and how much you trust them means that there's more reason to trust bigger things. But on a really big thing like a God claim, that's not something you just trust.
Well, that's why
there's no reason to trust
that. That's why I used the specific example I did. In the same way that I would trust my own eyes.
This show isn't arguing whether or not crocodiles exist, dude. We're arguing whether or not God does. And you're calling in as a theist saying, well, if I saw a crocodile, you could probably believe me. And I'm saying, right, why do you believe in God? And I heard somebody that I trust talk about it isn't good enough.
Yeah, I apologize if I have been unclear about any of this. I hope it's not, I hope I'm, anyway. In the example, okay, screw the example for we both know crocodiles exist now. What I was trying to get at was a novel phenomena. Another example you could use contemporarily is if someone saw an alien, or if I saw an alien, or if I saw any other, fantastic thing.
An extraordinary claim. An extraordinary claim, yes.
And that's why I would say that if I saw that in that moment, I would trust my senses. And critically, if
no one's arguing with that.
Okay. And no one, well, I thought there was argument about the trusted.
You're right, Paul. Sorry. Yes, we are allowing that to slide. I mean to say, you're right, Paul. If you called in and said, well, I saw God, then we would argue about that. We're moving past that. We're now at the part of you trying to convince us. Thank you for catching that, Paul. Well, I appreciate you.
Anyway, the point was, I called in without knowing, like, if you guys had anyone you trusted personally, who had any of this experience.
Not for a claim like that.
But here's the thing. no, but I'm gonna the person I trust the most, who is myself.
I thought he was going to say me.
When I was a
Hurt.
no, when I was you're like
Don't
number
deny it. That
4.
would've been wholesome.
Shannon's up there. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So I myself had many experiences that I felt were supernatural while I was a theist, and when I was deconstructing my faith, one of the things I had to think about was, well, what about all those things I experienced? And because I shared them like they were miracles, I shared them like they were big deals. And but then I looked back and I thought to myself, well, might I have been mistaken? I wasn't lying; those were my experiences, so I know that about myself. But was I mistaken? And as I analyzed those, I began to see, you know what? I might have been misattributing something. And so it is not entirely about trust. The person you trust the most in this world can be wrong about things and can misattribute even, and our senses are like unreliable to the sense that we can be 100% sure we saw a thing and it just wasn't accurate. Like our brains fill in all kinds of gaps, which Forrest can describe far better than I ever could. So no, I'm the person I trust the most, and I know that I've been wrong about things. So I can't put myself in a position where someone telling me about a thing that they're doing, maybe I could get so far as to say, well, you know what? You saw something that looked like an alien. I might be able to get too far with people I trust that I would grant that you saw something that you thought was an alien. But what I cannot jump along with is that you saw an alien, right? Like that's an important distinction for someone you trust.
And
how
I was just going to say,
I'll grant all day long that people had. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think like we said, or like you said at the beginning, we might have just come to a fundamental difference in epistemology. To me, if I can't trust my senses, I don't know how to reason past that, even if in the example of fantastical claims, because I know there's been so many things humans have experienced that was novel and seemed fantastical, and then, was necessary for them to believe in before they had scientific evidence. That's why I kept coming back to the crocodile example, though I'm sure we're all tired of hearing it, so I won't go any further with that. But that's basically where I'm at. I mean, look, I would just ask one thing, Paul. Do you have a video on those experiences you were talking about and how you came to question them?
Probably, I think I have a video called "Why I'm Not a Christian," which probably goes into it a bit, and then there's probably random stuff on my live channel. But you know what? If you want to talk about that next time I'm hosting a line show, feel free to call in, and I'm happy to. We've gone along for a long time, but I'm happy to lay out some of the things that I thought were supernatural experiences and what I attribute them to now. But yeah, we don't have time today, unfortunately.
Yep. Yeah, we got to move on. Jack, thank you sincerely.
Thank you both. I appreciate it very much.
Take care. Yeah, thank you sincerely for calling in. It's frustrating where we feel like we get nowhere, but like at least we're taking the time to parse these things out.